I'm running a spring sale over at my shop with up to 25% discount on selected products like prints, stickers, notepads, and bookmarks. Sale ends really soon, so make sure to check it out. Thank you! Hi everyone! So I've got some brand new marker pads from Ohuhu that claims to be all bleed proof, that you can actually draw with alcohol markers on both sides of the page without the ink showing through at all. Too good to be true, I don't know. Let's put them to the test. And full disclosure, Ohuhu did actually send these to me to try out and make a review of, but as always I will share my own and honest opinion. One is spiral bound and the bigger one is glued like a regular paper pad, but you can still use it as a sketchbook if you prefer to. And also one of my favorite parts is that the paper is nice and thick, and if you would like to try this out yourself, there will be links in the description box below. So if you are a user of alcohol markers, you may know that the ink often bleeds through to the other side of the paper and sometimes even to the surface underneath, which makes markers not very well suited for drawing with in sketchbooks. Bleed-proof paper is nothing new. There are paper pads specially made to use with markers, but this paper is often very thin and flimsy and the ink will still go through the paper. However, when it comes to these kinds of marker pads, the term bleed-proof often refers to bleeding or feathering of the ink on the surface of the paper. It basically means that the ink will not spread out sideways, so bleed-proof doesn't really mean that the ink won't go through the paper. But in this case, the paper in these new Ohuhu marker pads should be bleed-proof in the meaning that the ink should not go through the page. I am super curious to try them out. Let's just do a real quick swatch with the markers on a regular piece of paper just to have something to compare to, and I'm putting this protective sheet under because I am fairly certain that the ink will bleed through this paper. So for the first swatch, I just did one quick pass with the marker, and then for the second one, I went in a little heavier doing multiple layers. And for the third swatch, I did a lot of blending using different colors. So I went in quite heavy with the ink on this one too. So let's see how it looks on the back side. The ink is definitely showing up on the other side, especially on the ones where I did multiple passes. It almost looks identical to the front side. And even on the swatch where I went a little lighter with the ink, you can still see a lot of bleed throughs. And I just realized that I should have put another piece of paper underneath so that we could actually see if it is bleeding through to the surface underneath. Let's see. I don't really see any staining from the ink on the lighter swatch, but from the one that I did multiple passes on, you can clearly see that the ink bled through to the other paper. So we have the control swatches. Now finally, let's try the actual marker paper. So let's start with just doing one light pass. So the moment of truth. Nothing. I can't see any specks or anything from the ink bleeding through. Alright, so let's do multiple layers. Oh no, we got some smearing, and that is actually something that Ohuhu gave me heads up about. Since the paper is coated or treated to become bleed proof, the ink may take a little longer to dry, especially when adding multiple layers like I did here. So that is something that you will have to keep in mind. I obviously forgot about it. Let's just do a couple of more layers. Let's see. Look at that. Only thing that I can actually see is a little bit of warping of the paper from the moisture of the ink. Other than that, I can't see any ink at all. Let's try the rainbow gradient blending. So just like with the other swatches, I can't see any ink on the back side. Again, there is a little bit of warping from the moisture of the ink. Also, let's do a swatch on the back side just to see that the bleed proofness is equal on both sides. On other marker paper, you can't really draw on the back side of the paper because of this special coating, but on this paper you should be able to draw on both sides. Drawing with the marker on the back side looks exactly the same as on the front sides, and also no bleeding through. Alright, so the paper is obviously holding up really well when it comes to normal usage, but what I want to know now is how much ink does it actually take to make it go through the page. So I think I'm just gonna start with adding a lot of layers with the markers directly. This time I'm gonna use the chisel nib. So that is 10 layers of ink and still nothing. So let's go for 10 more. Still nothing. So let's go for another 10. $99, 100. Alright, so let's see what happens after 100 layers of markers. And nothing at all. Look at that. Not even a little dot of ink. There is nothing. And just to make sure, the marker is still working, but I still want to see if I can make the ink go through the paper. So I'm just gonna pour straight up alcohol ink and we'll see what happens. So here you can clearly see how the ink is pooling up on the surface of the paper. I think that is the whole trick to this paper, that it is coated or treated with something to prevent the ink from going in too deep into the fibers of the paper, and that is why it takes a little longer for the ink to dry. So let's check the back side, and still nothing. 100 layers of markers and pouring ink directly on the page, and the ink is still not going through the paper. But how is it to make an actual illustration on it? Let's find out. So the line art for this piece is actually from a couple of years ago. I made it as a coloring page for Patreon, and I just thought it would be perfect for testing this marker paper because it is a person, so you can see how it is to blend the skin tones. There are a lot of smaller details, so if the ink feathers and spread out over the lines, it will be more noticeable. There are also bigger areas like the background, which will show if the ink turns out streaky or patchy. It also has room for a lot of different colors, which allows for a lot of blending and mixing. And also, of course, it is a mermaid and her kitty mermaid or permaid, so it is perfect for mermaid. Is that still a thing, by the way? Mermaid? So let's dive into the coloring, and I will let you guys know my thoughts about this marker paper from Ohuhu. I'm starting with the skin of the mermaid. Blending skin tones is a good way to test the paper because it becomes very noticeable if the colors turns out streaky or patchy, which says a lot about the markers too, but I have worked a lot with Ohuhu markers and I know that they are good and they can make nice blending and gradients. It was a little tricky blending the darker brown that I used for shading with a lighter mid-tone brown that I used as a base color. Sometimes when the gap between two values is too big, one color is too light, one color is too dark, it takes more effort to have these two colors blending together. So maybe I could have used another tone between those two colors to make a smoother blend, but I still think it turned out pretty good. I don't really see any super big difference. I did try blending the same two colors, the darker brown and the lighter mid-tone, on my regular Bristol board that I normally use with markers, and they blended just fine. But maybe because the Ohuhu paper is more resistant to the ink going into the paper, maybe the blend isn't as smooth or easy when the two colors are too far from each other in value. I don't know. What I do know is that besides the dark brown, which is the darkest shade in this whole piece, All the other colors that I used and blended and mixed together came out looking really good. I didn't experience any patchiness or muddy, oversaturated areas, and I did really try to add in as many colors and different gradients as possible without it starting to look tacky, of course. And I am very impressed how the paper could handle all the layers of ink. Some areas like the mermaid's tail and her hair, and also the seaweed, I went over several times with many different colors, but the paper held up really well and all the colors mixed together nicely without them turning muddy or gray or brown. I really love how colorful this piece turned out. It makes me so happy to look at. I did notice some spreading or feathering of the ink where it went in a little heavier on the blending. I could see some of the color seeping over or under the lines, but that is quite normal when it comes to alcohol ink. It wants to spread. You kind of learn how to work around that, to not color too close to the lines and to not be too heavy on the ink application. The more ink, the more feathering. Sometimes it happens anyway though, but if I compare it to the Bristol board that I normally use, it wasn't really a big difference, to be honest. Something that I was a little worried about before I even started working on this review, the risk of smudging. Ohuhu had warned me beforehand that the ink takes a little longer to dry on this paper, and I even experienced that when doing the test earlier. It is really hard to not drag your hand over the paper when drawing with markers. It is for me anyway. I need a support for my hand, so I thought maybe that will be the deal breaker. However, I completely forgot all about that when working on this piece. I just carried on as usual, coloring, dragging my hand all over the place, and the ink didn't smudge at all. Thankfully, zero smudging. I think the smudge risk is higher if you make many layers all at once and really saturate the paper with ink, like I did in the test stage earlier, so in that case, you might have to be a little more careful to not smudge the ink. Filling in a larger area with markers can be tricky, so I was curious to see how coloring the background would be. There is always a risk with bigger areas that the colors will turn out patchy if the paper absorbs the ink too quickly, or that there will be visible seams if you go over the same area multiple times after the ink has dried. But since the ink dries a little slower on this paper, it gives you more time to go back and forth without getting seams between the different layers. And because the ink isn't absorbed by the paper the same way as with regular paper, the colors don't look patchy. And the background here isn't one solid color, since I'm using many different shades of blue to make it look like there is sunlight coming from the surface, but still it looks very smooth and well blended. I'm adding some finishing touches with white and gold gel pens and then some texture with color pencils. So, what's the final verdict regarding this marker paper from Ohuhu? I have tried so many different kinds of paper to use with markers before I found my beloved Bristol board. Did I mention the Bristol board? This paper is definitely giving a tough competition. I don't really have anything to complain about or anything negative to say. Or maybe I wish it would be a little thicker. It is already pretty thick. It isn't a thin paper, but maybe 250 grams instead of 150. And I would love a size A4. Since I'm living in Europe, that is the standard size. But other than that, I am super impressed. The ink doesn't go through the paper, so you can use both sides if you want to. And the colors looks great on it and blends nicely. Having a good paper that works well with a medium, no matter what medium it is super important. So I can really recommend these marker pads, absolutely. So here it is, our mermaid and her cute little mermaid companion. A whole illustration and not a single drop of ink is going through. I hope you like this art as much as I do. I love how colorful it is and that you found this review somewhat helpful. Please check out the links in the description box below if you'd like to try the Ohuhu marker pads yourself. Thanks Ohuhu, and thank you guys for watching. That's all for now. I will see you next time. Keep drawing, my happy cats. Bye!